Oh, and by the way, Germany has recently entered a recession, and Germany's economy is not faring too well. Especially in the long term, it's going to face serious economic problems, given the fact that as a result of the immigration crisis, it's going to take an even greater strain on their economy. That's another economy that has a social market economy. Again, a social democracy. These social democrats, what are they crying out for? Strong government regulation. They're not calling out for social market economies.
Argument number 10. But those countries are, ethnically homogenous. You can compare that to a racially diverse country like the US. This is my favorite argument here by far. I love it. If you're a conservative or libertarian and you make this argument, just bless you. Please keep making this argument as much as you can. It's a wonderful argument, and I want you to go down to the comment section of this video and explain to us in detail why you think the racial demographics of a country are relevant.
Now, this is an argument I find rather quite strange because as a libertarian, it doesn't cross my mind about the whole racially diverse thing. I don't really take that much interest. What I'm interested in is looking at individuals as individuals. See, so long as that individual supports the free market economy, he's more than welcome. And that's the way I view things. I don't care about all of that. What I'm interested in, whether someone believes in collectivism or believes in the free market. If someone believes in collectivism, they believe in using violence against you and would inevitably lead your economy down the road to serfdom. Whereas if someone believes in individualism, it doesn't matter what religion they are, it doesn't matter what background they're from. So I don't know where you get this from. Some believe in controlled immigration for different reasons, for economic reasons, and some believe in that of the open borders, but that's a whole other argument. So I don't know why you included libertarians into that. It doesn't make sense. Sure, some conservatives might have that argument, but who's to say the conservative doesn't have that argument for economic reasons? And there's no problem with that argument, and there are some people who are a danger, who are being let into the country, such as terrorists, and I speak about specific individuals.
Argument number 11. It's easy to afford social programs when the US military is providing your national defense. First of all, it's usually the conservatives who argue that military spending isn't an issue, and that we only need to cut social spending, so this is a funny argument for them to make. Now, there's no reason for our defense budget to be $700 billion a year, yet small government conservative types are totally cool with that. Yeah, even if every single NATO country met its suggested 2% of GDP defense budget, that would only be another 1% of their GDPs. Really not a huge deal. They could slightly raise taxes or slightly cut spending, or even borrow a bit more and still be more in the green than we are. It's really not that big a deal. And by the way, this argument wrongly assumes that having a social democracy is expensive, when in fact we are the ones spending 2 to 3 times as much per capita on healthcare. We are the ones who should be worrying about how much this is costing us.
Again, these economies have strong economic business freedom compared to that of the United States of America. The medical costs in America and how much the government is spending, that serious problem is because of the third-party payer system, because of everything to do with the AMA monopoly, the overregulation of the private sector. I've covered all of that, even responding to Vox's own video on healthcare and why American healthcare costs are through the roof. Because even if you were to turn your attention to Sweden again had turned to that of the private sector. It brought in private initiatives. These Scandinavian economies are social market economies. They're not social democracies.
Argument number 12. We spend so much more on healthcare because we're the ones funding research and development. If we adopted universal healthcare, then no more medical innovation would occur. It's not true, but for the sake of argument, let's assume that if we let the government negotiate drug prices or allow us to import cheap pharmaceuticals from Canada, then they'll be forced to raise prices in Europe and Canada. Why is that a problem? What happened? I thought you guys were America first. America first. But it's just not true. The reason we pay so much more for inexpensive pharmaceuticals is that Big Pharma lobbies against policies that would lower drug prices. And the reason we pay so much for general health care is because of for-profit insurance companies and higher administrative costs. Also, that part about medical innovation is going off the myth that All progress comes from the free market, so if the government negotiates for lower drug prices, then they'll stop innovating, which is nonsense. New medical products will still be extremely profitable, and this argument completely ignores the impact of public R&D. It's not the CEOs and shareholders who are the ones developing these breakthroughs, it's the scientists and engineers who do. And if somehow private R&D falls, then we can more than make up for it with public funds and university research. Jonas Salk created the polio vaccine and chose not to patent it because he didn't create it for profit. He created it to cure people. Speaking of which, poor, isolated communist Cuba beat the US to a lung cancer vaccine, and the US still hasn't caught up with it. And even in a social democracy, and in social democracies that are around today, there are still private R&D companies, but even today, private R&D is almost always done in cooperation with universities, nonprofits, and with taxpayer funding from the NIH. If you're really concerned about R&D, then join us in advocating for more education and research funding.
The argument on American healthcare costs, like I said, I've already covered in the video that responded to Vox. Pharmaceutical companies got away with a collusion. They didn't drive the cost down, they actually drove the costs up. And they got away with a collusion by driving the costs up on the consumer simply because of the very fact that there's a third-party peer system. And whose fault is that? That's the fault of the United States government. How does a third-party peer system get anything at all to do with capitalism? Because a capitalist system is the freedom of the marketplace for consumers to shop around for the cheaper cost, where it's a straight transaction between the consumer and the provider. Now, there's a monopoly through the third-party peer system, meaning that the consumer is forced into a position where the third party is the one with the monopoly over cost, getting to determine the cost. So it's no wonder why they got away with a collusion, because of the absence of competition, because of the absence of the free market. In other words, the mixed economy, all thanks to the so-called social democracy type policies, that's precisely what resulted in that of the strongly corporatist, expensive, inefficient American healthcare system that you see today.
Argument number 13. Social programs make people lazy because they have no incentive to work for a living. This is the classic talking point the right-wingers use against the poor. First of all, nearly all social programs have strict eligibility requirements, and for adults under the age of 65, they generally require you to have a job or to be actively looking for work. Statistically, the overwhelming majority of able-bodied adults on social programs are either working or in between jobs, and cases of fraud are a tiny percentage of the money given, and the amount given is never enough for someone to just live off welfare. And more importantly, you know the drill, social democratic countries are thrashing the US in terms of their employment to population ratio and labor force participation rates.
Again, the Scandinavian economies, you would only have to look at the real unemployment figures, not the official figures, and that's where you're taking them from. You're looking at the official figures and you're basing that argument, but that's based off the recent unemployment. That's not even looking at the real unemployment figures. And the real unemployment figures is much higher because of the fact that people cannot find jobs. Why? Because they've got a lack of incentive to do so in the Scandinavian economies. Yes, it does actually destroy the incentives, but that's not the main reason. If you want to see the real cost and how damaging the social security system is, just stare in the face of your $21 trillion debt level in the United States. After all, the social security system was the largest contributing factor to your $21 trillion debt level. Now try telling me that debt makes you rich. That's a bit like saying that if you go out and borrow money and, buy a Ferrari and drive about in it, that you're rich. The fact of the matter is you borrowed that money and you need to pay it back.
Argument number 14. Taxation is theft and healthcare is not a right. Unless you're an anarchist, in which case I can't help you, you believe that a democratically elected government has the right to tax citizens for the benefit of society. You really can't pretend that a legitimate government levying taxes to fund civilization is the same as an illegitimate actor mugging you. So the overwhelming majority of us agree that taxes should exist and we should have a government, but we disagree on what the role of government should be, hence the claim that healthcare is not a right. Just so we're clear, nobody actually believes that healthcare is just another commodity and not a right. Let me ask you a question. If a child isn't doing well in school, do their parents have a right to say, I won't buy you any more video games if you don't get straight A's and B's this semester? So, bad grades, no video games. Is a parent allowed to do that? Yeah, I think we can all agree that's reasonable. Now, does the parent have a right to say, if you don't get straight A's and B's this semester, then I won't take you to the hospital. If you break your neck or get run over, then tough luck. Bad grades, no medical treatment. How come the disparity? Why can a parent deny their kids video games but not healthcare? Because we all agree that video games are a commodity while healthcare is a basic human right.
The fact of the matter is, it is theft. There's not even a question, and it's not even a debate on that matter. In order for it not to be theft, you require consent, and one only needs to understand the definition of the word consent in order to know that you need the permission from people. Now, if you do not have written permission from people, and you take something from someone without their permission, what do you call that? You call that theft. In 1843, the income tax was imposed on the British people without their consent. In 1913, the income tax was imposed upon the American people without their consent. How can you take something by law, and it doesn't matter if it's written in law, if it was made in law, and if all law was right, then that means that all law in communist countries is right then. Moving on to the argument on rights. If you have a right to something, you've got the entitlement to it. When it comes to things like the British NHS, which is universal healthcare, how on earth can you say that people have a right to healthcare? That's basically saying that you have a right to the earnings of another individual. After all, another individual in society has to go out there and work for that money, and they are forced to pay into a collective pot. It's not a case of just handing money over voluntarily. They are forced to pay the income tax to pay for such systems like the NHS. Are you trying to tell me that you have some sort of God-given right and entitlement to the earnings of another individual? For you to say that healthcare is a right is for you to say that those who out there working in jobs, you're saying that you have a right to the earnings of their money and that they are your slave and that they have some sort of duty to serve you. It's a bit like saying, a job is a right. A job isn't a right. Nor is food some sort of right. Nor is education a right. You don't have a right to the earnings of another individual. You only have the right to the money that you work for yourself.